What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
I don't love to give attention to attention seekers like Michael Shellenberger, but he is one of these people who has made a living out of complaining about San Francisco and about California. And he wants to be your governor as well as a trusted voice on the environment and trans people and unhoused people. His most recent book is called San Francisco, and I can't recommend it. My only takeaway was that he wants the rest of us to thank him for being one of the only people brave enough to blame unhoused people for problems that have to do with how society's wealth is distributed. He's also behind nonprofits that are funding things like Together SF, which brought us the That's Fentalife billboards, and anti-woke warriors like Erica Sandberg and Tom Wolfe. He's a big supporter of people who get off on recording unhoused people having psychiatric emergencies on the street. And he's effectively pushing to get overdose numbers up, promoting replacing safe consumption sites with forced rehab, which we know never works. And although the SF Chronicle is not the place that I have traditionally turned to for opinions on what is happening locally, they made a strong choice in Soleil. They are a columnist there who's also beloved for being able to write about food and talk about food in a way that I think is interesting, even if you're not into food criticism or narratives. And we recently talked about one of their recent columns about Michael Shellenberger's attempt to paint himself as an expert on all things trans. As always, you can find our past episodes in the archives at patreon.com/sadfrancisco. You can also throw some cash our way there to help us pay for transcription and editing of the show. I was wondering if you could start us out by talking about who Michael Shellenberger is and who are some of his local allies.
For sure. So Michael Shellenberger, maybe a lot of people have known or heard of him. They've heard of his book, San Francisco, How Progressives Ruin Cities. And that came out pretty recently in the past couple of years. And it made the case that San Francisco was on the decline. It was being ruined, was going to fail as a city because of its progressive sort of leftist leadership and the voters, of course, who put them in power. And he uses the examples of homelessness and crime to talk about that. And what is interesting to me is that this is such a terrible analogy, but it reminds me of how sometimes McDonald's Happy Meals will have toys that are like themed after movies that come out. And so his book has come with a galaxy of sort of nonprofit organizations and on the ground advocates, and has really coincided with a lot of the folks who make a pretty decent living filming people in the Tenderloin, for instance, filming drug users, exploiting that whole population of people who maybe get $5 for appearing in the YouTube video. A lot of similar things unite all of these nonprofits. I'm not saying that they're all his, but certainly his organization, Environmental Progress, funds a lot of them through grants. And that's a pretty interesting kind of background to this whole thing, is that there's a lot of like seeding that's been happening through Shellenberger and his organization, which is based in Berkeley. And so I guess to speak to his allies, I think his allies are just the people he funds directly through what one would call mutual aid, which is very cute and funny. So yeah, there's local groups that are financially affiliated with him, including the Pacific Alliance for Prevention and Recovery, which is led by a person named Tom Wolfe, funded to the tune of $40K. There's Jackie Berlin, who's the head of Mothers Against Drug Abuse and Death, who's also on the board of Environmental Progress and was granted $50K. Shellenberger's kind of colleague who writes with him on his Substack, which is called Public, Leighton Woodhouse, who got $12K, and Erica Sandberg, who is part of San Franciscans for Peace and Justice, got $5K. And then there's these other groups, California Peace Coalition, North America recovers. And what you'll notice about the websites in particular is that they all look the same and they all have the same formatting, which is really interesting. They're not very cagey about that, even though the whole structure is kind of cagey.
Right. Like maybe they're all coming from the same place.
Maybe.
Yeah. He also seems to have, at least in San Francisco, he really plays up this narrative that he is a reformed socialist.
Just like you and me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's this pragmatic dude. He's like positioning himself as this moderate. And in your piece in the Chronicle in November, which we'll link in the show notes about Shellenberger, you do speak about how the term moderate is used in SF politics. Could you describe that for people who have very little experience in local politics in San Francisco?
Sure. But also as a sidebar, will this be the first time that y'all have linked a Chronicle story in a positive way? Because that would be really funny to me.
I'd have to look, but I hope that you'll come back to speak out some of your other pieces, because I do appreciate that you offer a voice that we don't really hear from in a lot of corporate media, but I think you might be right. So congratulations.
And they should thank me for that. That's amazing. But yeah, as far as moderates go, I found it really interesting as someone who spent a lot of time living in various parts of the country, in the Deep South, in the Midwest, and the East Coast. The moderate liberal divide in San Francisco is so unique to me. Maybe it's just because of the timing of me being here, but essentially everyone's a Democrat. Everyone's a Democrat except for the people who are the Republicans who all hang out together. And it's like maybe a couple dozen people in a room. But to get anywhere here politically, you have to be a Democrat. And that is just how it works. And so within that, there are the quote unquote liberals, there's the progressives, there's the moderates. And how I would describe the moderate is they're cool with gay marriage. And they're cool with the sort of liberal, basic sort of civil rights portfolio. But when it comes to economic justice, they're not there. And they're not interested. They're not interested in giving anything up in those terms. They're very pro-police. They're very much just pro-corporate. And they're ostensibly on the left. But I would say moderate is also a self-given moniker. And I think that's a really important thing to note here is that if you call yourself a centrist, if you call yourself moderate, or someone who's just in the middle, that is a political choice, right? You are deciding everyone to the left of you is insane. Everyone to the right of you is insane. You are the only sane person in politics. And I use those words to kind of contextualize, right? Like that perspective. And the moderates are saying like, we are reasonable. Everyone else is just completely out of pocket. And it is very much that sort of boomerish, silent majority kind of rhetoric that is coming back in a big way here. And so moderate is a way of saying, we're not like the MAGA people. We're not on the right. We're just kind of on the right. But we are, again, normal. And I think whenever you call yourself normal, you're making a really interesting judgment call about everyone else. So I don't know. It's so hard to pin down because it's just so fake, right? Like,
I agree. Yeah, no, super well put. And yeah, again, like it puts you in a position where people like Shellenberger are forced, because they are the only ones who have any sense about them, to come into these, I guess, progressive strongholds like San Francisco and fix all of the problems that are happening locally. And
also, but like to interrupt, sorry.
Totally.
But I think there's a really important point that 48 Hills columnist Tim Redmond makes a lot, which is San Francisco has never been run by like true progressives, like beyond maybe George Moscone, right? The sort of progressive boogeyman that people like Shellenberger throw up there as being the ones that led San Francisco off the cliff, largely not there. And so it is just this specter, right? This like abject kind of phantom that it's just there as a punching bag. When you think about progressive rule, very few people in San Francisco have actually experienced that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going back to the 70s and like you said, Moscone and Harvey Milk, that time is kind of used as like a blanket, like this is politics in San Francisco, I think. And today, I mean, the Board of Supervisors, like you do have socialist Dean Preston on the Board of Supervisors, but the majority of people on the Board of Supervisors I would consider to be pretty conservative, voting for increasing police funding and things like the recent bill that Scott Wiener, a former supervisor for San Francisco, got passed at the state that is forcing the city to build market rate housing, when I think most people who will be listening to this will recognize that there's already a lot of empty market rate housing in the city. I was wondering, on the topic of housing, like Schellenberger's book, San Francisco, which was a New York Times bestseller, he posits that he himself was having these questions about why was like the unhoused population and just the problem of there being unhoused people in places like San Francisco and Seattle, and people with psychiatric disabilities out in public as being this really big problem that we're dealing with in West Coast cities. This kind of boosted his profile, this book, San Francisco. Could you talk about like his thesis in the book?
Yeah. So it can be kind of hard to pin down because there's just so much. What's interesting is there are a lot of really like legitimate frustrations, right? Like people should not be living on the streets. They should have homes, right? People who need care should be able to access care. If there were beds, like, oh my God, like who'd have thought, right? We should fund that kind of care. And yet the main takeaway of the book is that we have all these problems because progressives love victims. And to me, that is like the core of Shellenberger's whole thing. And it's also very deeply, deeply right-wing to believe that it's because people on the left just love a victim. They love people who play the victim, they play the race card, or et cetera. And it's what Shellenberger calls victimology, which is this belief that like people who are marginalized or disadvantaged are exempt from the rule of law, right? Exempt from standards that civilization should require of them. And that is the bedrock, he says, of progressive policy. And it is the reason why cities like San Francisco are driven to complete anarchy. So to me, that is the spring from which there are so many other ideologies that have been born that Shellenberger has since then, since the publication of the book and since he got really big on Substack, has trafficked in.
Yeah. He seems to be like sort of massaging the egos of his readers who will probably already be coming from a point of view that lends itself to being aligned with this idea of victimology. What I got from some of having read the beginning of the book.
You didn't finish it, Toshio?
I did not. Yeah.
It's quite a read.
Damn. I mean, it was very much like, oh, this person takes himself so seriously. I think he believes it, even though he is a politician and has run for governor a couple times.
Right. And what is really interesting, too, is that his share of the vote hasn't been nothing. It hasn't been 0%.
Yeah.
People
up
have
to
voted
4%.
For him.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like, I don't know, 1 million people, however many.
Yeah, California's big. So there are people that are reading this stuff and paying attention to it. One of the responses that I've gotten around criticizing individual figures in local politics is that it can encourage them to do more of the same. But I was wondering what you think about this argument and like why call out Michael Shellenberger specifically?
Right. That's a really good question. And I definitely, as a columnist, as someone with a platform, I measure that pretty carefully, right? I'm not going to start a fight online if a person insults me, right? Like some person with no power whatsoever. And I certainly am sent a lot of hate mail, and I'm never going to put that person on blast because who are you? Right? You're just frustrated. And I get that. But someone like Shellenberger, I think, is an interesting person to critique, and actually an important person to critique because of how many pots he has his hands in financially and ideologically and just in terms of support. Like I said, his group, Environmental Progress, is a pretty big funder of a lot of discourse and rhetoric about the city through the people that they send grants to. They support these other nonprofits. They support the people who are filming people in the Tenderloin, right? And that is a facet of San Francisco that is pretty well known and publicized, especially on Twitter. He has the support of Elon Musk. He was one of the people who received the quote unquote Twitter files. He has a lot of important people's ears. And I think that's why it's important to talk about him, because he has power And I think that if you are doing something to fuel discourse, then you are an interesting person to think about and talk about, because what is behind that, right? Understanding you as a person will help other people understand like what is behind what they're hearing about a place or people.
Yeah, because he's representing, like you said, 4% of California's voters who voted in the last gubernatorial election did vote for him. So he's representing more than just himself.
Right. Yeah. And again, his newsletter is huge on Substack too. So he's a person of influence. And so, of course, he is important to talk about.
He's friends with Gary Tan, who we've talked about on the podcast. And he's absolutely one of the things he's trying to sell recently has been himself as someone whose voice needs to be heard on gender. How does he talk about trans people?
I recently wrote a column, which will be linked, I believe, in the show notes, about his recent appearance at GenSpect's big conference in Denver this year. And so GenSpect, if you don't know, is this huge organization, probably the biggest one in the world, that has been kind of the leading light for the many people who have, quote unquote, questions about transness. And the sort of, I don't think they would identify as TERFs. I think they're more inclusive than that. They're all about just being the place for people who have questions about gender, what they would call gender ideology. So their conference included quite a few Californians, including Shellenberger, people who are also going to be pushing for legislation this coming year, or I guess this year, Jesus, it's 2024, who are hoping to push policies that will make it harder for youth to access gender-affirming care and to have sensitive experiences at school. So what Shellenberger said is that we are creating gender dysphoria through ideological means. And that's a quote. He believes it's manufactured by the media and just by this kind of conspiracy of radical sort of gender reformists, I guess. And WPATH, which is largely considered to be one of the more careful and also the most esteemed organization that informs the medical establishment on gender affirming care. And he includes, oh my God, I'm just looking at my notes because it's just so much. So part of his whole thing too is pathologizing progressives and pathologizing anyone who falls into these buckets of people who maybe support critical race theory or have thoughts about racism being real, who believe in the humanity of trans people, right? People who are on the left, people who believe that police reform is something that matters and should happen. And he, being not a doctor or anyone associated with psychology,
Right.
just being some fucking guy, he's diagnosed these people on the left with cluster B personality disorders. In a way, he is pathologizing not only people who are not cis, but just anyone who disagrees with him with narcissism and antisocial disorders and just hysteria. It's so interesting from his perspective. People who are trans are just mentally unwell and are not getting the correct care when they are being allowed to transition. So yeah, he says a lot about gender and not very nice things, not very good things at all, not very humane things.
Yeah. He has so many opinions about gender that you see from other figures on the right, other kind of pundits that we think of as being Newsmax or Fox News adjacent. He's spouting a lot of the same rhetoric that they are, and really doesn't believe that people should have self-determination over their own bodies. I know that in the book, he describes and has people and trans people as dangerous while he's being condescending at the same time, which goes back to what I was mentioning about him sort of being so frustrated and kind of disgusted with places like San Francisco. But at the same time, he's this hero who has to come in and do this Herculean task of cleaning up San Francisco because he and people like him are the only ones who have the minds to do that. And another argument that he uses that you mentioned in your Chronicle piece from November, you characterize him as someone who uses system justification. Could you describe what system justification is?
Sure. So System justification is this term coined by political psychologists to talk about why people have more conservative or more liberal preferences. And it doesn't really track closely with either end of the spectrum, but it does track with authoritarian sort of tendencies on either side. But essentially, it's this idea that your ideology springs from your need to justify the rightness and the justice of the world, right? Of the existing social order. So, for instance, let's say you want to say something about homelessness, right? People aren't homelessness because the system is not running well. You're deeply invested in the system being perfect and good. And so the only explanation that makes sense is that people who are experiencing homelessness are doing something wrong, right? Like they are the ones that are violating the social order, not capitalism, not the housing system, not anything on a macro level. It is the micro only. So it allows you to maintain your belief in the social order and kind of pivots your frustration or anger toward individuals, essentially.
Yeah, that the status quo is great, that as is, the world is how we want it. So you wrote this piece in the Chronicle, and there was a lot of response to it online. Of course, like you said, San Francisco is like a punching bag for the rights to like a degree that like is shocking to me. Like my boyfriend will get texts from his dad because his dad saw something on Fox News. His dad lives in Virginia. And he'll hear about something that happened locally, like the mayor did this. Can you believe that your mayor's doing this? Painting our mayor as a progressive, like sort of villain when our mayor's not progressive at all. But that's kind of the vibe that a lot of the rest of the country has with regards to San Francisco.
Right.
I feel like you gave a pretty good like lay of the land as far as, who he is. And I mean, why we really should be paying attention to this guy who wants to be the leader of California.
I think something that I neglected to bring up, which I think is really important actually, is regarding system justification. And a huge part of the motivation to do this comes from this underlying desire for certainty. You, as someone who maybe will end up wanting to justify a system, wants familiarity. You want comfort. You want to do something certain and not pursue a path that would require giving anything up or struggling for something new and better that you have not heard of before. So I think like that is really, I think to me, the fear and disgust towards people who are not gender conforming also comes from the same place. To me, that was the connection. That's what made me want to write this column, because like for a lot of folks who are not so deeply online, making that connection inherently might be really confusing and unintuitive. And that's why I wanted to write about this, because this is all the same thing. You don't realize that because they're two different topics, right? And like someone who's an expert on gender identity might not say the same, like say that they're an expert in housing crisis, right? But like this reaction to those things is all the same.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's really important, I think, to talk about in like a neoliberal kind of framework, like a lot of people kind of work within in San Francisco, like how discomfort and inconveniencing the people like Shellenberger is so much of the reason why someone like Shellenberger is trying to sort of force his ideology upon the rest of us. I imagine that a lot of people, like their discomfort with using someone's pronoun, like has so much to do about like why they are so concerned with just being in charge of who gets to say what's what in local governments, that people like Schellenberger can't stand being asked to go out of their comfort zone at all.
Right. And it is very much, I think, this desire to pathologize people who don't agree with you or who seem different from you. I mean, to me, that is just a really strong indicator, right? That they don't intend to take folks seriously at all.
Yeah, they need to justify the world that they live in their own minds, and they don't take well to being told otherwise. Because in many cases, I mean, with Schellenberger, like guess. Like, I don't know too much about his early life other than like his socialist past and his wanting to be an environmentalist earlier on in his life. But it seems like he didn't want for much earlier in his life. The last question I wanted to ask is regarding TERFs, who I think love to represent themselves as underdogs who are under constant threat of cancellation. I found links to your piece on, like, I guess it's Jesse Singles, who formerly wrote for The Atlantic, where he got a lot of criticism for his writing on trans people and now runs a Substack. And your piece had been included as reading about what the other side is writing and thinking. And Jesse Singles' Substack, it's called like Blocked and Canceled. That's not it. Blocked and Reported is what it's called.
Cute.
And like evoking like this, like the cancellation by the woke mobs. Do you see them letting go of this cancellation narrative in 2024? Does it still like hold a lot of weight in those circles as far as you can tell?
It's an election year, so we'll see how they do at the polls. But I think that given the losses that, for instance, Moms for Liberty, one of the big sort of anti-CRT, anti-trans groups in the US, seeing how they've done pretty badly in elections in the past year, who knows, right? They might decide that this isn't the tack to take. But certainly there have been a lot of politicians that have leaned into this, despite the fact that polling shows Americans largely don't give a shit about trans stuff. And not in a rude way necessarily, but more just they don't care. They don't care about the one trans athlete at high school who got 5th place in cross country, right? Like, it doesn't matter to so many people. Pew has done quite a few surveys, but a recent one that I saw from 2022 was, I would say, let's see, do the math here, but essentially about 60% of US adults say either like, yes, acceptance of trans people is good for society, or yeah, don't care. So, I mean, that is so interesting to me. But at the same time, given the fact that we don't live in a truly representational democracy and gerrymandering has made it so that it is really hard for progressives to win in most districts in the United States, it's a toss-up. And I hate to say that, and I hate to be so vague about it, but it really, you don't know. The will of the people is not necessarily what is often enacted politically. But I would hope that more and more people are understanding that this is an issue that matters and that they are not going to be able to be led so unconsciously by folks like Shellenberger. I think there's more consciousness, like just broadly speaking, and institutions like the New York Times are going to be dragged kicking and screaming into the future. Hopefully they will get on board eventually, but it's so hard to say. But I will say that victimhood, the victimology that Shellenberger complains about all the time, is like essential to authoritarianism. Like, victimhood is essential to the authoritarian identity, and feeling like you're under threat constantly is a huge part of what solidifies the base and solidifies ideology and closes ranks and allows people to engage in these sort of reactionary politics. So yeah, I mean, if the right leans into that, then yeah, transphobia will be a part of that.
Yeah. Well, I hope that this is a year that trans people stop being demonized. And again, we'll link to the piece that we spoke about today in the show notes.
And just as a note, if you ever need trouble getting over any paywall, not saying that you should get over the Chronicles paywall, if anyone's listening from work, archive.ph will get you over there.
There we go. A little, roundabout way to get at the piece. Appreciate it. Again, thank you so much, Soleil.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco. The show is produced by Toshio Moronic and edited by Tofu Astolas. You can go to patreon.com/sadfrancisco for our past episodes and to help us pay for the transcription and the editing and the hosting of the show. See you next time in Sad Francisco.